Imagine yourself in Amsterdam, February 3rd, 1637. The air in the local taverns is thick with the scent of cheap beer and a suffocating sense of excitement. On a stained wooden table, there are no jewels or gold bars. Instead, people are worshiping a small, brown, withered object that looks like nothing more than a common onion. This is a Semper Augustus tulip bulb, and its price? 5,200 guilders. To put that into perspective, that single bulb could buy you the most opulent mansion on the Grand Canal, fully furnished, with its own private warehouse. Or, if you prefer, it represents 12 years of income for the most skilled master craftsman. 12 years of a human life traded for a living organism destined to bloom for a few fleeting weeks before withering away. But why? It wasn't just simple greed, and it was a collective trance. From weavers mortgaging their looms to farmers liquidating ancestral lands, everyone plunged into a gamble, fueled by the naive belief that prices can only go up. However, the truth behind this madness is far more complex than a mere frenzy. It is a story of an economy overflowing with wealth, a fatal legal loophole, and a biological virus. This mania didn't sprout from poverty. It erupted at the heart of the most dynamic nation on earth, the Dutch Republic. They possessed the VOC, a supercorporation larger than Apple and Microsoft combined today. As wealth from the spice trade flooded in like a tidal wave, the Dutch faced a rich man's problem. Where to invest when every traditional market is saturated? They found the tulip. But the tulip was no ordinary asset, and it carried within it a dramatic biological paradox. What truly turned the tulip into a speculative firestorm was a silent attacker, the mosaic virus. This virus invaded the bulb, breaking its natural pigments to create vivid, flame-like patterns that looked as if they were painted by hand. The sheer randomness of this disease created genuine scarcity. Yet, there is a detail history often overlooks. The most expensive and beautiful flowers were, in fact, the weakest. The virus crippled the bulbs, making them difficult to reproduce and prone to early death. Dutch investors were essentially trading their life savings for dying assets, a desperate exchange between ephemeral beauty and eternal value. Yet, the frailty of these bulbs was more than a biological quirk. It was a mirror held up to the dark reality of the age. In the 17th century, and human life was just as precarious and fleeting as a tulip in bloom. But what drove these otherwise rational people to act like madmen? The answer lies in the Black Death. As the bubonic plague swept through trading hubs, survivors suddenly found themselves with massive inheritances from the deceased. When death could arrive by next Tuesday, saving for the next 20 years seemed absurd. The YOLO mentality of the 17th century was born. Gambling wasn't just about money. It was a way to feel alive while the Grim Reaper was knocking at the door. Yet, some economists argue that the Dutch weren't crazy at all. They were simply exploiting a government blunder. When rumors spread that the law might convert futures contracts into options with only a 3.5% penalty for backing out, the market turned into a risk-free casino. And if you won big. If you lost a pittance. In such a setup, who wouldn't place a bet? But no amount of legal maneuvering or financial gambling could withstand the cold clarity of the coming spring. Then, the music stopped in early February 1637. Not because of war, but because of nature. As the first green shoots emerged from the frozen soil after a long winter, illusion was replaced by reality. Investors realized that the flowers were about to bloom in abundance, and there was no greater fool left to pay a higher price. Within 48 hours, the value of tulips plummeted by 99%. The market froze in a dead silence. For 400 years, we've been told that Tulip Mania destroyed the Dutch economy. But modern historians, after scouring the archives, have uncovered a different truth. There were very few actual bankruptcies, and most of the horror stories were penned by Calvinist ministers as moral fables to warn against the sin of greed. This mania may have been more of a short-term crisis of confidence, magnified into a historical legend. Whether the crash was as catastrophic as rumored or not, its lesson remains timeless. As long as humans are driven by greed and fear, new tulips will always appear, whether they are called .coms, real estate, or digital currencies. Price is never the same as value. Leverage always amplifies destruction, and we are always brilliant at inventing complex theories to justify our madness, right up until those first green shoots rise from the ground. So, take a long look at your portfolio today. Is there a tulip in there waiting for its moment to bloom and fade? And to understand why our modern portfolios still haunt us with the ghost of the tulip, we must travel back to the source of the frenzy, to a time and place where the very foundations of modern wealth were being built and then tested to their breaking point. Chapter 1: The Golden Age and the Plague. In 1637, the Netherlands stood as arguably the wealthiest and most dynamic nation on Earth. While not boasting the highest per capita income or the richest individual cities, when measured by its concentrated commercial power, unparalleled global trade dominance, and sheer, audacious financial innovation, the Dutch Republic was undeniably without peer. Amsterdam's bustling harbor alone processed more cargo than the combined ports of London and Hamburg. An immense fleet of over 16,000 Dutch merchant ships commanded nearly half of all global trade routes, solidifying their maritime supremacy. The Dutch East India Company, a titan of its era, remains the most valuable corporation in history when adjusted for inflation, and with an estimated modern-day valuation of a staggering $7.9 trillion. This colossal sum surpasses the combined worth of contemporary giants like Apple, Microsoft, and Saudi Aramco. The nation's wealth was not merely theoretical, it was staggering in its scale and strikingly visible. Prosperous merchants constructed magnificent 5-story townhouses along Amsterdam's picturesque canals, adorned with polished marble floors and exquisite crystal chandeliers painstakingly imported from Venice. Even the burgeoning middle class, a relatively novel social concept for the time, enjoyed comfortable brick homes featuring coveted glass windows, multiple fireplaces for warmth, and even household servants. Remarkably, even skilled laborers could regularly afford to consume meat several times a week, and a luxury practically unheard of for their counterparts across the rest of Europe. This unprecedented prosperity stemmed directly from a uniquely innovative economic model. The Dutch, in essence, had perfected the principles of capitalism decades before the term itself was even coined. They established the world's first formal stock exchange in 1602. Furthermore, they pioneered modern banking, introducing sophisticated systems for deposit accounts, checks, and credit, fundamentally reshaping financial transactions. They also developed robust insurance markets, introduced commodity futures, and meticulously constructed vast international trade networks that seamlessly connected Amsterdam to far-flung regions such as Japan, Indonesia, Africa, and the Americas. However, with such unprecedented wealth came a new set of challenges, as distinct from those faced by the impoverished. Specifically, once one had acquired all necessities and desired luxuries, the pressing question arose: what precisely should be done with the accumulating capital? In the flourishing Amsterdam of the 1630s, the compelling answer increasingly became ambitious investment. Affluent merchants, not content with merely profiting from trade goods, sought vigorously to expand their already substantial fortunes. Middle-class families, aspiring to elevate their social standing, eagerly looked for avenues to increase their prosperity. Even servants and laborers, who were earning considerably more than their counterparts across other European nations, harbored ambitions to accumulate genuine wealth, moving beyond mere subsistence. Crucially, what often goes unrecognized is that the Dutch Republic had, and in fact already dipped its toes into the waters of speculative investment, even before the advent of tulips. During the 1620s, for instance, a minor but noteworthy craze had swept through for rare and exotic seashells. Then, in the early 1630s, hyacinth bulbs experienced a fleeting surge, with prices escalating by an astonishing 300 to 400% before their inevitable collapse. The lucrative pattern was thus firmly established. Rare and exotic objects, characterized by their limited supply and inherent high status value, possessed the potential to generate immense returns for those astute enough to buy early and sell to the next eager participant, willing to pay an even higher premium. Tulips, in particular, appeared to embody the perfected manifestation of this speculative model. They were genuinely, demonstrably scarce. Cultivating new, indesirable varieties was a meticulous process requiring years of dedicated effort. They possessed an undeniable, visible luxury. Indeed, showcasing rare tulip varieties in one's garden served as a more potent and immediate signal of wealth and sophistication than almost any other material possession. Furthermore, tulips carried a profound international cachet. Originating from the exotic and distant Ottoman Empire, they were inherently associated with the opulent courts of sultans, the allure of harems, and an overarching aura of Eastern mystique. Underlying this fervent appeal for tulips was a society that had recently undergone a period of truly monumental transformation. The Dutch had only recently secured their hard-won independence from Spain after an arduous 80 Years' War, a brutal and protracted conflict. And they had decisively cast off the yoke of Catholic rule, instead embracing Protestantism, particularly the strict tenets of Calvinism, which famously preached that worldly material success served as tangible evidence of God's divine favor. Furthermore, they had forged a unique republican government at a time when the vast majority of Europe remained firmly under the dominion of absolute monarchs. This confluence of factors fostered a truly unique national psychology. The Dutch firmly believed themselves to be exceptional, convinced that their unprecedented success was undeniable proof of their destiny for greatness. They felt that the conventional rules, those that had historically kept other nations impoverished and stagnant, simply did not apply to them. This wasn't mere arrogance. Rather, it was a profound confidence, meticulously backed by decades of hard evidence. Indeed, virtually everything the Dutch had attempted over the preceding 50 years had yielded remarkable success. So, why, they reasoned, would tulips prove to be any different? However, beneath this veneer of soaring prosperity, a darker, more unsettling element quietly lurked. That element was the bubonic plague. It's the grim context that most financial textbooks leave out. Throughout the mid-1630s, the Black Death was tearing through the Netherlands, particularly in Haarlem, the very heart of the tulip trade. This created a bizarre economic paradox. The high mortality rate caused a severe labor shortage, which actually drove up real wages for the survivors. At the same time, many people suddenly found themselves flush with plague wealth, cash inherited from deceased relatives. But more importantly, it shifted the psychology of the entire nation. It created a 17th century version of YOLO, you only live once. When you know you might be dead by next week, saving for retirement seems pointless. Gambling on a flower bulb in a smoky tavern wasn't just greed, it was a form of fatalism. It was a way to feel alive, to grab a piece of fortune before the lights went out. Some historians even suggest that the crash started in Haarlem simply because the buyers didn't show up to the auction, not because they were smart, but because they were sick. But while the plague drove the survivors into a gambling fever, the very financial machine they used to place those bets was far more fragile than anyone dared to admit. The nation's immense wealth, while undeniable, and was in reality unevenly distributed and inherently precarious. Merchants who had amassed staggering fortunes in the lucrative spice trade could, in an instant, lose absolutely everything should one of their precious ships sink at sea. Moreover, the economy was heavily reliant on credit, creating intricate debt chains that interconnected thousands of individuals. A single default by a major trader could trigger a devastating cascade, reverberating through dozens of interconnected businesses. Compounding these vulnerabilities, the continuous influx of silver and gold from their extensive global trade routes was generating significant inflation, rendering traditional, more stable investments far less appealing. Thus, and one can clearly discern the confluence of factors that created the quintessential environment for a speculative bubble, an abundance of capital aggressively seeking high returns, a population profoundly conditioned to believe that bold innovation and calculated risk-taking were surefire paths to immense wealth, a cultural ethos that openly celebrated material success as a sign of divine favor, and finally, an object, the tulip, that appeared to offer both genuine aesthetic value and the tantalizing promise of limitless price appreciation. The stage was meticulously set. The eager actors, from the wealthiest merchants to the humblest laborers, stood poised. All that was needed was a single catalytic spark to ignite the nascent collective mania into an uncontrollable conflagration. But all these grand economic forces and national psychologies were merely dry tinder, waiting for a catalyst to turn a growing interest into a raging fire. That spark would come not from a king or a merchant, but from a microscopic invader that transformed a simple flower into a masterpiece of nature. Chapter 2. The Fatal Paradox. The catalytic spark that ignited this feverish speculation came from an utterly unexpected source, a virus. Not one that afflicted humans, but a remarkable virus that infected tulips themselves. This infection produced breathtaking color patterns, so exquisitely beautiful, so genuinely rare, and so visually stunning, that these broken tulips instantly became the most coveted objects within the wealthiest society on earth. When intense desire collides with extreme scarcity in a market awash with abundant capital and few compelling alternative investment options, the consequences are, in hindsight, tragically predictable. To understand how such madness began, we must rewind to the spring of 1593 to a quiet botanical garden in Leiden. There, a professor carefully planted the very first tulip bulbs in Dutch soil, utterly unaware that these simple, beautiful flowers would, just 4 decades later, bring the burgeoning economy he inhabited to the brink of ruin. This professor was Hierolus Clusius, a distinguished botanist. Standing in his garden at Leiden University, he meticulously examined a fresh consignment of bulbs that had journeyed all the way from the distant Ottoman Empire. Clusius was a true pioneer, one of the rare professional scientists in an age when scientific disciplines were still in their nascent stages. For decades, he had traversed the vast landscapes of Europe and Asia, assiduously collecting exotic plant specimens and meticulously documenting countless species previously unknown to Europeans. The precious bulbs within that box were tulips, and a vibrant flower known to grow wild in the rugged mountainous regions of Central Asia and cultivated with great reverence by Ottoman gardeners for almost a full century. In the Ottoman Empire, tulips were deeply cherished. Indeed, Sultan Ahmed III would later become so profoundly obsessed with them that his entire reign would be famously designated as the Tulip Era. Palace gardens blossomed with hundreds of distinct varieties, poets immortalized them in verse, artists adorned canvases with their likeness, and affluent officials vied intensely to cultivate the most breathtaking specimens. Within Ottoman culture, tulips held profound symbolic meaning, representing nothing less than paradise itself, divine grace, and the epitome of earthly perfection. Conversely, in the Netherlands, tulips were utterly unknown entities, and Clusius carefully planted his newly acquired bulbs within the Leiden Botanical Garden, an academic institution affiliated with the university, and primarily utilized for instructing medical students on the properties of medicinal plants. Initially, these tulips were regarded merely as scientific curiosities, primarily serving as educational specimens and nothing more. When the first flowers finally bloomed in the spring of 1594, they presented themselves as simple, unpatterned blossoms in shades of red, yellow, and white. Certainly pretty enough, but far from extraordinary or captivating. Dutch gardeners who encountered them exhibited only mild interest, certainly no genuine excitement. After all, the Netherlands was already abundant with a rich variety of native flowers, fragrant roses, elegant lilies, and vibrant carnations. Why? And they might have wondered, should one become truly excited about an exotic import from distant Turkey? Then, an unforeseen and pivotal event occurred. A portion of these tulips became infected with a mysterious pathogen, what we now know as the tulip-breaking virus. Intriguingly, in 1594, the very concept of a virus was entirely unknown to science. Crucially, this infection did not prove fatal to the tulips. Instead, it dramatically transformed them. The virus cleverly disrupted the normal pigment distribution within the petals, thereby creating breathtakingly elaborate patterns, vivid flames of color, delicate feathered stripes, and intricate designs that appeared almost as if meticulously hand-painted. These broken tulips were truly spectacular. A single bloom might showcase fiery red flames dancing across pristine white petals, or vivid purple streaks accentuating a vibrant yellow base. Crucially, no two were ever exactly alike, and the mesmerizing patterns were entirely unpredictable. One could not intentionally cultivate them. Rather, one simply planted a bulb, patiently awaited its bloom, and then, with bated breath, discovered whether a plain tulip or a genuine masterpiece had emerged. This inherent randomness, as we shall see, proved absolutely crucial to the unfolding events. Had broken tulips been simple to produce, they would have been commonplace and inexpensive. However, the virus transmission was remarkably inconsistent. The vast majority of tulips remained plain, and only a small, unpredictable percentage ever developed these coveted beautiful patterns. Once a bulb did produce a broken tulip, it would, thankfully, and consistently continue to yield that identical pattern in subsequent blooms. Propagation was possible by carefully splitting the mother bulb and cultivating offspring bulbs that would exhibit identical coloring. This critical factor meant that broken tulips were genuinely rare, not artificially scarce, like diamonds whose supply is meticulously controlled by entities such as De Beers. But there was a darker biological reality driving this scarcity, a fatal paradox that 17th century science couldn't possibly understand. We now know that the mosaic virus was actually parasitic. It was a trade-off devised by nature. In exchange for those stunning, flame-like patterns, the virus was slowly starving the bulb. While healthy, plain tulips multiplied quickly and robustly. The broken ones, the ones worth a fortune, were sickly and weak, and they struggled to reproduce. Their offspring were often smaller and fewer. So the market wasn't just chasing beauty. It was chasing a dying asset. The most valuable commodities in the entire Dutch economy were biologically destined to go extinct. This created a natural, physical cap on supply that no amount of money or farming skill could overcome. Their rarity was authentic, stemming from the immense difficulty, painstaking time investment, and sheer dependence on luck involved in finding or developing a truly new, broken variety. Carolus Clusius immediately recognized the extraordinary value of these unique specimens. He judiciously began selling both bulbs and seeds to affluent Dutch merchants and discerning nobles, who eagerly sought exotic plants to adorn their burgeoning gardens. Consequently, tulips, and particularly the prized broken varieties, rapidly ascended to become potent status symbols among the Dutch elite. In the early 1600s, cultivating a garden brimming with rare tulip varieties unequivocally signaled not only immense wealth, but also refined sophistication and sufficient connections to procure such coveted, exotic imports. However, Clusius also developed a possessive streak. He began to hoard his finest and most desirable bulbs, steadfastly refusing to sell them at any price. His intention was clear: to maintain absolute control over the nascent tulip cultivation industry within the Netherlands. From a market dynamics perspective, this proved to be a monumentally ill-advised strategy. By severely restricting the supply of highly coveted goods, while demand continued its inexorable growth, he was, in effect, and inadvertently creating the perfect conditions ripe for widespread theft. Predictably, in 1596, audacious thieves breached the security of the Leiden Botanical Garden, making off with the vast majority of Clusius's precious rare tulip bulbs. These stolen treasures were then sold to shrewd merchants who had long been frustrated by Clusius's obstinate refusal to trade. In turn, these new owners promptly began propagating the bulbs, selling their offspring to an ever-widening circle of affluent buyers. This pivotal act of theft effectively shattered Clusius's nascent monopoly, allowing tulip cultivation to rapidly proliferate throughout the entire Dutch Republic. By the turn of the century in 1600, dozens of opulent gardens proudly showcased their burgeoning tulip collections. A decade later, by 1610, that number had swelled to hundreds. And by 1620, tulips had become sufficiently prevalent that a robust merchant-class market had fully developed, allowing individuals to acquire bulbs from specialized growers who had honed considerable expertise in cultivation and breeding. It is crucial to understand that throughout this nascent period, roughly from 1593 to 1630, tulips functioned essentially as a normal, albeit desirable, luxury good. Naturally, rare varieties commanded high prices. An exceptional broken tulip, for instance, might fetch 100 guilders, a sum equivalent to several months' salary for a skilled craftsman. However, this was well within the established range for other high-end luxury items, such as exquisite furniture or prize-winning horses. During this time, the market remained small, specialized, and remarkably stable. Growers diligently cultivated their bulbs, and affluent collectors acquired them, their prices accurately reflecting genuine scarcity and inherent aesthetic value. Critically, there was virtually no speculation. No one purchased tulips with the explicit expectation of reselling them for exorbitant profits. The motivation was purely personal enjoyment. One bought them simply because one desired beautiful, coveted flowers for their garden. Yet, as the late 1620s approached, a confluence of interconnected factors began to emerge, poised to irrevocably transform this stable, predictable luxury market into something far more volatile and perilous. Firstly, tulip cultivation had advanced considerably, enabling growers to produce significantly larger quantities of bulbs. While this increased supply might ordinarily have led to lower prices, simultaneously, and the thriving Dutch economy was generating immense wealth from its extensive global trade networks. This meant that an ever-growing number of people could now readily afford luxury goods. Consequently, demand was escalating even more rapidly than the burgeoning supply. Secondly, certain specific varieties had attained almost legendary status. The Semper Augustus, for instance, a sublime white tulip adorned with striking red flames, was universally acclaimed as the single most beautiful flower in existence. Only a mere handful of its bulbs were known to exist. Possessing a Semper Augustus was thus akin to owning a masterpiece by Rembrandt or a spectacularly rare diamond, conferring not just wealth, but immense cultural prestige. It wasn't merely a display of material wealth, it represented significant cultural capital and a badge of refined taste and societal prominence. Thirdly, and perhaps most critically, the inherent cultivation cycle of tulips inadvertently created fertile ground for speculative opportunities. Tulip bulbs could only be planted in autumn and harvested in summer, meaning that for a significant 9-month period each year, the actual physical bulbs could not change hands. While the bulbs lay dormant and growing in the soil, the fervent desire to buy and sell them persisted unabated. To circumvent this physical limitation, a sophisticated futures market rapidly developed. For instance, in November, a grower might sell a promissory note for bulbs that were contractually obligated for delivery the following June. The buyer, therefore, was not acquiring actual bulbs, but merely a piece of paper, a legal promise, for future delivery. This paper itself could then be freely traded, mounted, or even used as collateral for loans, effectively becoming an early and rudimentary form of financial derivative. Initially, this financial innovation was intended to bring greater efficiency to the market. Growers could secure sales well in advance, thereby reducing their inherent risks. Buyers, in turn, could lock in favorable prices long before the planting season began. The expectation was that everyone would benefit from this increased market liquidity and stability. However, what absolutely nobody anticipated was that the trading of these paper promises for tulips would quickly become far more popular and dynamic than trading the actual physical bulbs themselves. The reason was simple. Paper was immeasurably easier to transport, simpler to store, and, crucially, could be traded year-round, unconstrained by seasonal growth cycles. This detachment from the physical bulb transformed the tulip into a pure financial vehicle, allowing the fever to spread beyond rare masterpieces and infect even the most ordinary corners of the market. Within a remarkably short span of a few years, the sheer volume of these tulip futures contracts ballooned to exceed the actual physical supply of bulbs by an astonishing factor of 10. Pause for a moment and consider the profound implications of this. People were actively buying and selling promises for tulips that, in many cases, had not even come into existence. These promises were then resold to others, who in turn sold them again, creating intricate chains of obligations that would ultimately have to be settled with actual bulbs, bulbs that quite possibly did not exist in anything remotely approaching the required quantity. By 1630, the burgeoning tulip market had distinctly bifurcated into two main tiers. The high-end segment, comprising rare, named varieties with meticulously documented provenance, remained remarkably stable. Here, affluent collectors continued to pay substantial, yet ultimately reasonable prices. Concurrently, the low-end market for common bulbs, destined for middle-class gardens, also remained stable and readily affordable. However, a volatile new middle tier was rapidly emerging. This segment consisted of moderately rare bulbs that boasted decent coloring but lacked any particular historical fame or prestigious lineage. These bulbs weren't quite prestigious enough to be coveted collector's items, and yet they were sufficiently scarce that a new class of speculative buyers became convinced their prices would inevitably soar. It was precisely within this nascent, volatile middle tier that the true madness would ominously begin. Then, in 1633, an inexplicable and seismic shift occurred. A Scipio tulip, a moderately rare variety boasting elegant red and white flames, sold for an astounding 1,500 guilders. This staggering sum represented 5 times the price that comparable bulbs had commanded just 2 years prior. No one could rationally explain this sudden, dramatic surge. The tulip itself was unchanged. Its intrinsic value remained identical. Neither the buyer, a person of no exceptional wealth or prestige, nor the seller, an individual of no particular fame, seemed to warrant such an inflated transaction, and the price simply, inexplicably, jumped. And once that single Scipio had exchanged hands for 1,500 guilders, a powerful ripple effect began. Everyone else who possessed a Scipio tulip instantly believed their own bulb was now worth at least that much, if not, indeed, even more. The logic, however flawed, was seductive. If someone had paid 1,500, surely another eager buyer would pay 1,600. This, then, was the pivotal spark. It marked the precise moment when tulips transcended their botanical origins and transformed from mere flowers into speculative assets. The act of purchasing a bulb was no longer primarily about cultivating a beautiful garden, but rather about the calculated gamble of selling it to a subsequent buyer at an even higher price. The mania had truly begun, and a collective fever that would accelerate with a velocity and intensity far beyond anyone's wildest imagination. By January 1634, what started as a simple luxury had metastasized into a potent status symbol. In that very month, an Amsterdam silk merchant named John Van Am made headlines by paying an astonishing 3,000 guilders for a single Viceroy tulip bulb. To truly grasp the scale of this transaction, consider that a highly desirable house in Amsterdam during this period also commanded a price of approximately 3,000 guilders. For further perspective, A skilled craftsman earned a mere 250 guilders in an entire year, and a robust milk cow could be purchased for 100 guilders. John Van Am had thus just expended the equivalent of 12 years of a skilled laborer's wages, a sum capable of buying a substantial home. I'm all for a single flower bulb. His rationale? He had observed another merchant acquire the identical variety for 2,400 guilders just 3 months prior, and that merchant had already reportedly received an offer of 3,500 guilders from an eager buyer in Haarlem. Van Am, therefore, confidently projected he could flip his viceroy for an impressive 4,000 guilders by spring. He was no longer purchasing a beautiful flower. He was acquiring a calculated investment poised to yield a staggering 33% return in just 4 months. And here's the pivotal, unsettling truth. He was absolutely right. In April 1634, Jan Van Am successfully sold his viceroy bulb for an incredible 4,200 guilders. He had netted a phenomenal profit of 1,200 guilders and a sum equivalent to nearly 5 years' salary for a craftsman, all within 3 months, and simply by virtue of possessing a tulip bulb. Once tales of these extraordinary, almost unbelievable profits began to circulate widely, the entire psychology of the market underwent a profound and complete transformation. Tulips ceased to be merely a luxury commodity exclusively for affluent collectors. Instead, they were now unequivocally perceived as the single finest investment opportunity available throughout the entire Dutch Republic. They were deemed superior to investing in ships, which could tragically sink at sea, better than real estate, which demanded constant maintenance and upkeep, and certainly preferable to lending money, which always carried the inherent risk of default. By the summer of 1634, the tulip frenzy had engulfed every social stratum. People from all walks of life were enthusiastically acquiring tulip bulbs. Affluent merchants were strategically converting substantial portions of their lucrative trading profits into tulips. Industrious middle-class shopkeepers were eagerly investing their hard-earned savings, accumulated over years of diligent work. Even the most humble laborers and servants were assiduously scraping together every guilder they could spare to purchase the cheapest bulbs available, all driven by the fervent hope of riding the seemingly unstoppable wave of price increases that everyone else appeared to be enjoying. The burgeoning tulip market rapidly permeated every facet of Dutch society, becoming the dominant topic of spirited conversation in Amsterdam's bustling taverns, Leiden's vibrant marketplaces, and Haarlem's elite merchant halls. Individuals who had previously shown no interest whatsoever in floriculture suddenly transformed into self-proclaimed experts on tulip varieties, passionately discussing the relative merits of admirals versus generals, debating whether striped varieties would definitively outperform flame varieties, and meticulously analyzing price trends as if they were seasoned professional traders. However, a significant practical problem quickly emerged. The most spectacular and highly sought-after rare varieties, those experiencing the most dramatic price increases, remained far beyond the financial reach of the average person. A single Semper Augustus, for instance, cost an astronomical 5,500 guilders in 1634, and a sum greater than most individuals would earn in their entire lifetimes. Even moderately rare varieties, like Viceroy and Scipio, were priced in the thousands of guilders. Faced with this barrier, the market, ever adaptable, innovated. To democratize access, sellers ingeniously began offering shares in bulbs rather than demanding the purchase of an entire bulb. For example, one could acquire a 1/10 share of a prized Viceroy tulip for a more manageable 300 guilders, as opposed to the full 3,000 guilders required for the complete bulb. This innovative approach made even the most expensive varieties accessible to aspiring middle-class buyers. Crucially, it meant that a single rare bulb could now have 10 different owners, each fervently convinced that they would inevitably profit as its market price continued to escalate. This fractional sharing system also imbued the market with significantly greater liquidity. Should an individual require quick access to cash, selling a 1/10 share was far swifter and easier than divesting an entire bulb. This enhanced accessibility naturally attracted a torrent of new buyers, which in turn propelled prices even higher, attracting yet more eager participants into the escalating spiral. What was unfolding before their very eyes was, in essence, a textbook case of asset bubble formation. Of course, no one in 1634 possessed the economic vocabulary or foresight to recognize it as such. The very concept of an asset bubble simply did not exist yet. Nevertheless, the underlying psychological dynamics were uncannily identical to every speculative bubble that would inevitably follow. Firstly, and the earliest adopters reaped extraordinary and tangible returns. Jan van Am's 1,200 guilder profit was undeniably real. He could, and did, spend that money. Others witnessed this tangible display of newfound wealth and were inevitably drawn in, eager to claim their own share. Secondly, success stories circulated like wildfire, while failures were conveniently suppressed or entirely ignored. Everyone eagerly discussed the merchant who had miraculously doubled his money in just 3 months. Yet nobody spoke of the unlucky collector whose expensive bulb failed to bloom, thereby rendering his investment utterly worthless. Thirdly, rigorous analysis was swiftly supplanted by facile rationalization. Instead of critically questioning why tulips were commanding such astronomical prices, people shifted their focus to how high prices would ultimately ascend. The fundamental assumption that prices would continue their relentless upward trajectory became a self-evident premise that no longer required any logical justification. Fourthly, established credentials and expertise ceased to hold any sway. A humble weaver who had never made a single investment in his entire life now firmly believed his judgment regarding tulip prices was just as valid and insightful as that of an experienced wealthy merchant. After all, both were, for the moment, making money. In this distorted reality, immediate success was perceived as undeniable proof of inherent wisdom. By the autumn of 1634, the burgeoning tulip market had evolved to possess its own elaborate infrastructure. Professional tulip traders, and individuals dedicated solely to the buying and selling of bulbs, established formal offices in major cities. They meticulously published detailed price lists, systematically tracking the fluctuating values of popular varieties. Standardized contracts for future delivery were meticulously drafted, and they even innovated a specific unit of measure called an ace, allowing for even finer fractional trading of bulbs. This rapid professionalization inadvertently bestowed a veneer of credibility upon the market. With professional traders and official price lists now in existence, the prevailing sentiment was that this could not possibly be just a craze. It must, by all appearances, be a legitimate and robust industry, and people consequently felt a greater sense of security investing their capital when the market presented itself as so organized and sophisticated. Yet, beneath this carefully constructed surface of organization and perceived legitimacy, the market was, in reality, spiraling into a state of structural insanity. Indeed, by late 1634, the sheer aggregate value of all outstanding tulip futures contracts, those paper promises for bulbs slated for delivery in the summer of 1635, had ballooned to exceed the total value of all actual bulbs then in existence by an astounding factor of 20. Consider the mathematical implications of such a disparity. If every single tulip contract were to be honored, there simply weren't remotely enough physical bulbs to fulfill those obligations. Inevitably, and someone would be left holding nothing but utterly worthless paper. Yet, in the grips of this collective delusion, every participant optimistically believed they would sell their contracts before the inevitable collapse, confident they would find another eager buyer to pass the paper to. They truly convinced themselves they weren't gambling. They were merely being shrewd, discerning investors. Sensing the growing irrationality, the shrewd wealthy merchants who had initially ignited the tulip craze began a discreet, strategic withdrawal from the market in late 1634. They had already amassed their fortunes. They clearly perceived that prices had become entirely untethered from any semblance of rational valuation. A Scipio tulip, which cost 1,500 guilders in 1633, was now fetching an astonishing 4,500 guilders, and the physical bulb remained precisely the same. The flower it produced was identical. The sole change was that an ever-increasing number of people believed they could sell it for even more. Perversely, the withdrawal of these wealthy merchants did not decelerate the market's frenetic pace. Instead, it unexpectedly accelerated it. This was because, with their exit, certain prized varieties that had previously been financially unattainable for the middle class now became more accessible. For example, a viceroy that a wealthy merchant sold for 4,000 guilders might have cost 5,000 if elite demand had remained robust. This slight, temporary softening of high-end prices suddenly made those bulbs affordable for shopkeepers and craftsmen who had previously been entirely priced out. This dynamic created a powerful yet seductive illusion of democratization. Tulip wealth, it seemed, was no longer the exclusive domain of the rich. Now ordinary people, too, could participate and reap substantial profits. This appeared to be the very promise of the Dutch Republic made manifest, that success was not confined to inherited nobility or entrenched wealth, but rather that anyone could prosper through astute decisions and diligent effort. Of course, the stark reality was far more cynical. The wealthy merchants had already skillfully extracted their substantial profits. They were now systematically offloading assets, leaving middle-class and working-class buyers to hold the bag. Assets whose inflated values were sustained solely by the increasingly desperate hope of finding even more buyers. This was, in essence, the classic pump and dump pattern. While no one in 1634 was consciously orchestrating this scheme, it emerged organically and inevitably from the inherent dynamics of a burgeoning bubble. By December 1634, an astonishing figure of approximately 30,000 individuals across the Dutch Republic either directly owned tulip bulbs or held tulip futures contracts. Considering the total population of around 2 million, this implied that roughly 1.5% of the entire populace was directly embroiled in the tulip market. However, the indirect economic exposure was, alarmingly, far higher. Banks had extended significant loans, often collateralized by tulip holdings. Shops, in a bizarre turn, had begun accepting tulips as a form of payment. Entire families had pooled and invested their collective life savings into these volatile botanical assets. In short, and the entire Dutch economy was becoming perilously and intricately intertwined with the wildly fluctuating prices of tulips. Yet, amidst this collective euphoria, virtually no one was willing to acknowledge the glaringly obvious, fundamental problem. Tulips were, at their core, merely flowers. Beyond their fleeting aesthetic appeal and decorative value, they possessed absolutely no intrinsic practical use. Their perceived value existed solely because people believed in it, and belief, as history has shown, can dissipate with startling speed. In January of 1635, a Haarlem priest delivered a fiery sermon, fervently warning his congregation about the perils of tulip speculation. He condemned it as a perilous delusion, a sacrilegious violation of God's natural order, and a thinly veiled form of gambling masquerading as legitimate commerce. And his earnest admonitions were met with open laughter from the congregation. Several parishioners, with an air of smug superiority, proudly displayed their tulip futures contracts, boasting that they had already doubled their money and fully expected to do so again, perhaps even more. 3 months later, the priest passed away from natural causes. Within a year, many of those same parishioners who had mocked him would find themselves financially ruined, wishing they had heeded his solemn warning. Yet, in early 1635, such warnings were easily dismissed as either envious resentment or sheer ignorance. The burgeoning tulip market, they firmly believed, was the undeniable future. Anyone who failed to grasp this fundamental truth was deemed a fool, mired in outdated modes of thought. Progress, they argued, demanded embracing new opportunities, And tulips, without a shadow of a doubt, represented the most extraordinary opportunity the Dutch Republic had ever witnessed. The nascent mania was about to surge to levels that would strike later generations as utterly insane. What transpired in 1634 was merely a prelude, a gentle warm-up act. The true frenzy, the profound madness, would not commence until trading migrated from the sober confines of merchant offices into the raucous atmosphere of taverns, where virtually anyone with a few guilders could purchase a share in a bulb they would never physically see and scarcely comprehended. As the elite quietly retreated, the frenzy didn't die. It simply moved house. The obsession migrated from the polished mahogany desks of wealthy merchants to the beer-stained tables of neighborhood taverns, where the common man was about to turn a luxury hobby into a national catastrophe. Chapter 3. The Escalation into the Taverns. Trading officially began to pick up in February 1635. The first unofficial tulip exchange, a bustling hub of activity, opened its doors in a tavern famously known as Duden Twin, or the Golden Garden, nestled within Amsterdam's thriving warehouse district. The proprietor, a shrewd former merchant named Peter Clay, had keenly observed groups of men gathering in his establishment several nights a week, intensely trading tulip futures contracts. They would spread their papers across the worn tavern tables, engage in boisterous haggling over prices, seal deals with firm handshakes, and raise tankards of ale to celebrate their completed transactions. Clay, astute as he was, quickly recognized the potential to formalize this burgeoning activity, attract an even larger clientele of traders, and crucially, levy fees for facilitating these transactions. He promptly designated the tavern's backroom exclusively for tulip trading. He thoughtfully provided paper and ink for drafting contracts and prominently displayed current prices for popular varieties on a large, easily visible board. Most significantly, he introduced a standardized trading system. Anyone could enter the dedicated room and openly bid on tulips offered for sale, with every trade meticulously recorded in an official ledger. This innovation single-handedly transformed tulip trading from an exclusive merchant specialty into something remarkably accessible to ordinary people. One no longer needed to be an integral part of elite commercial networks, nor did one require privileged connections to the tulip growers themselves, and all that was necessary was to walk into Duden Twin with some ready money and the keen willingness to either buy or sell. Within a matter of weeks, 3 more taverns across Amsterdam had swiftly established their own dedicated tulip trading rooms. By spring, taverns in other prominent cities like Haarlem, Leiden, Utrecht, and Delft had quickly followed suit. By the summer of 1635, an estimated 40 taverns throughout the Dutch Republic were functioning as informal commodity exchanges, each specializing in tulip futures. This tavern-based trading system had, in essence, democratized speculation in a manner that no previous market had ever achieved. Traditional stock trading, for instance, demanded substantial capital and was largely restricted to an exclusive circle of wealthy investors. Real estate, likewise, required even more significant capital outlay and specialized expert knowledge. But tulip futures in these taverns could be traded with amounts as modest as 10 guilders, a sum roughly equivalent to a laborer's monthly wage. This meant that, for the very first time in European history, working-class individuals gained access to speculative investment. A humble weaver could now take his hard-earned savings, perhaps 50 guilders painstakingly accumulated over 2 years, and purchase futures contracts for tulips that held the tantalizing promise of tripling in value by summer. If his gamble paid off, he stood to make more money in a few short months than he could possibly earn in years of arduous weaving. The social dynamics within these trading rooms were nothing short of remarkable, and wealthy merchants sat shoulder to shoulder with common laborers. Esteemed university professors traded alongside semi-literate craftsmen. Even women actively participated, an extraordinary occurrence for the 1630s. Property law at the time allowed women to trade on their own behalf, and tulip trading was perceived as refined enough to be socially acceptable for respectable women. Records meticulously preserved by Amsterdam's notaries reveal that between March and October 1635, approximately 7,000 tulip futures contracts were formally registered in the city. Considering Amsterdam's population of roughly 120,000, this statistic implies that about 5 to 6% of the populace was actively engaged in tulip trading. And this figure doesn't even account for the unregistered trades, which were likely far more numerous. And however, it is precisely at this juncture that the system began to reveal its true, insidious danger. These tavern trades were not conducted with actual, physical money. Instead, they relied almost entirely on credit. When one purchased tulip futures in a tavern, there was no immediate exchange of guilders. Instead, you signed a contract, a legally binding promise to pay the agreed price upon the actual delivery of the bulbs in summer. If you wished to sell your contract before that delivery date, you would simply find another individual willing to pay a higher price for the same contract. They, in turn, would pay you the difference between the price you had originally agreed to pay and the price they were now willing to commit to. That difference, a mere paper transaction, constituted your profit. This ingenious yet precarious system meant that individuals could effectively control thousands of guilders worth of tulips with almost no initial capital outlay. A laborer earning 250 guilders annually could easily sign contracts to acquire 5,000 guilders worth of tulips, fully intending to sell these contracts at a profit long before he would ever have to pay a single guilder. This, quite simply, is leverage, extreme leverage, in its purest form. Such leverage implied that while potential profits could be extraordinary, the risk of catastrophic losses loomed equally large. If tulip prices continued their seemingly inexorable ascent, one could achieve fantastic returns on virtually no capital. But if prices plummeted, one would suddenly owe substantial sums of money that one didn't possess for bulbs that had become unsellable. The tavern traders, however, confidently assured themselves that this wasn't a risky proposition at all, precisely because prices had been consistently rising for 2 consecutive years. They meticulously examined historical data, poring over price lists from 1633, 1634, and 1635, and observed a consistent, reassuring pattern of appreciation. A Viceroy tulip bulb that commanded 900 guilders in 1633 now fetched a staggering 4,500 guilders. That represented an astonishing 5-fold increase in just 2 years. If that trend were to persist, 4,500 guilders would logically transform into 22,000 guilders by 1637. These projections, based on extrapolating past performance into the indefinite future, seemed entirely rational to them. This, of course, and is a classic cognitive bias that afflicts every speculative bubble, the unfounded assumption that recent trends will continue indefinitely. No one bothered to question why tulips should appreciate forever. No one dared to ask whether 22,000 guilders for a single flower bulb made any logical sense. The trend itself had become the sole justification. By autumn of 1635, the market had evolved into several distinct segments. First, there was the collector's market, comprising wealthy individuals who acquired truly rare named varieties, such as the coveted Semper Augustus, Viceroy, or Admiral van der Eyck, for actual possession, display, and aesthetic appreciation. This segment represented perhaps 2% of all trading by volume, but commanded a disproportionate 30% of the total value. And prices here remained relatively stable and rational, reflecting genuine scarcity and discerning aesthetic appreciation. Next came the speculator's market, composed of middle-class investors who purchased moderately rare varieties, like Scipio General or Bull Admiral, with the explicit intention of reselling them at a profit. This segment accounted for approximately 20% of the trading volume and commanded 50% of the market's value. Prices here were more volatile, but still maintained some tenuous connection to the collector's market as a pricing reference point. Finally, and most perilously, there was the gambler's market. This segment consisted primarily of working-class traders who bought common varieties or even fractional shares in better varieties, purely hoping to flip their contracts for quick, easy profits. And this dominated the market in terms of volume, representing a massive 78% of all trading, but accounted for only 20% of the overall value. Prices here were completely divorced from any rational basis whatsoever. People were simply betting, with reckless abandon, on the continuation of price increases. The gambler's market was where the true insanity of the Tulip Mania resided. In August 1635, a pound weight of common Switzer bulbs, a relatively plain and unremarkable variety, sold for 60 guilders. By October, the very same weight of bulbs commanded 120 guilders. By December, it had soared to 240 guilders. This particular variety was neither rare nor especially beautiful, nor was it particularly desired by discerning collectors. It was simply there, and its price was quadrupling every 2 months. Why? And because the tavern traders firmly believed that if common varieties were doubling and tripling in value, then rare varieties would surely increase even more astronomously. And if they bought common varieties now, they could always sell them to the next wave of eager participants who wanted to enter the market but couldn't afford the truly rare bulbs. It was, in essence, a pyramid scheme, albeit one that no one had consciously designed as such. This rampant gambling wasn't just creating paper wealth, it was unraveling the very fabric of Dutch society, forcing the authorities to finally confront a fire they had long ignored. The Dutch government, though belatedly, began to take notice of the rampant speculation, yet it remained unsure of how to effectively respond. After all, tulip trading itself was not illegal, and it was simply people engaging in the buying and selling of flower bulbs, a perfectly legitimate commercial activity. However, magistrates in several cities began reporting growing concerns. Laborers were neglecting their work to spend days on end in taverns trading tulips. Skilled craftsmen were borrowing heavily against their workshops to acquire futures contracts. And, alarmingly, servants were even stealing from their employers to invest in the feverish tulip market. In November 1635, the Amsterdam City Council finally passed an ordinance requiring all tulip contracts to be registered with notaries and attempting to limit the use of credit in tulip purchases. The stated goal was to slow down speculation by introducing more formality into trades and significantly reducing leverage. The ordinance, predictably, was largely ignored. Traders simply ceased registering their contracts officially. The tavern markets continued to operate precisely as before, only now they functioned entirely outside the legal framework. This disregard for the law made the market even more perilous, as there was no longer any official record of who owed what to whom. Everything now ran on a precarious foundation of trust, quick handshakes, and often ambiguous verbal agreements. By January 1636, the tulip market had ballooned to such an extent that it was profoundly affecting the broader economy of the Dutch Republic. Banks were issuing loans collateralized by tulip futures. Shops were accepting tulips as a legitimate form of payment for goods. Employers were even paying their workers partly in tulip bulbs, which the workers would then promptly sell for cash. And dowries for marriages were negotiated in tulips, and inheritances were divided using tulips as assets. This deep and pervasive integration meant that tulip prices were no longer just impacting a handful of intrepid speculators, they were affecting virtually everyone. If you owned a shop and a customer had paid you with tulip futures theoretically worth 500 guilders, the very finances of your business now depended entirely on those tulips maintaining their inflated value. If prices suddenly plummeted, your receivables would become utterly worthless, potentially bankrupting you, even though you had never consciously chosen to speculate. Consider for a moment the profound danger of this situation. The Dutch economy, one of the most sophisticated and advanced in the world, it was becoming increasingly dependent on the continuous appreciation of humble flower bulbs. This dependence wasn't due to any government mandate or policy. It was simply the collective result of thousands of individual decisions to utilize tulips as money, which had collectively transformed them into a de facto currency. And, like any currency, tulips required unwavering confidence. The very moment people stopped believing that tulips would maintain their value, the entire fragile structure would collapse. Not slowly, not gradually, but instantly. This was because tulip contracts were intricately woven chains of credit, with each link depending precariously on the next link being honored. Break one link, and the entire chain would inevitably fail. And the most sophisticated merchants and financiers in Amsterdam acutely understood this inherent risk. A select group of them met privately in December 1635 to earnestly discuss whether tulip trading should be outright banned or, at the very least, heavily regulated. The meticulously preserved meeting minutes, held in Amsterdam's city archives, clearly show that they recognized the presence of a dangerous bubble. Yet, they couldn't agree on whether intervention would ultimately help or exacerbate the problem. Some argued vehemently that prohibiting tulip trading would trigger an immediate collapse, devastating thousands of families who had invested their life savings in good faith. Others countered that allowing it to continue unchecked would eventually lead to an even more catastrophic collapse. Ultimately, the group made the worst possible decision. They decided to take no action, naively hoping that the market would correct itself naturally once spring arrived and the actual bulbs had to be delivered. By doing nothing, they effectively allowed the speculation to accelerate unchecked, while simultaneously lending it an implicit, dangerous legitimacy. If the city's revered financial leadership wasn't concerned enough to act, then ordinary people naturally assumed there was no problem whatsoever. The speculation continued its frenzied ascent. Leverage increased exponentially. The market grew ever more profoundly disconnected from any semblance of reality. By February 1636, a new and utterly bizarre phenomenon had emerged. Bulbs that didn't even exist yet were being traded, and growers would sell futures contracts for bulbs that hadn't even been planted, wouldn't bloom until 1638, and critically, might not even turn out to be the promised variety. These ultra-long-dated futures traded at massive premiums, fueled by the buyer's fervent belief that by 1638, prices would be vastly higher than they were today. This was pure, unadulterated financial mania. People were paying real money today for mere promises of bulbs 2 years in the future, with absolutely no guarantee that the bulbs would ever exist or that anyone would even want them when they were finally delivered. Yet, within the distorted logic of the bubble, these trades made perfect sense. If prices always rose, then future bulbs would logically be worth more than current bulbs. Therefore, paying a premium today for future delivery was, and in this insane context, deemed entirely rational. The mania had finally reached escape velocity. It was now entirely self-sustaining, feeding voraciously on its own momentum, and it was about to enter its final, most delusional phase, the peak. But behind the abstract numbers and frantic ledgers of the taverns were real lives, being staked on a single roll of the dice. To understand the human cost of this collective delusion, we must look at a man who had everything to lose, a weaver named John Van Dyck. Chapter 4. The Gambler's Trap. John Van Dyck. In late 1636, a Haarlem weaver named Jan Van Dyck made a decision that would define the tragic final act of the Tulip Mania. Jan was not a reckless man. For 23 years, he had operated his loom with diligent precision, supporting a wife and 3 children on modest wages. He was a man of caution and responsibility, having spent 2 decades resisting the siren song of quick riches. However, Jan was living through the most profound psychological torture a speculative bubble can inflict, the sight of everyone around him getting rich effortlessly while he remained on the sidelines. Everywhere Jan looked, the fools were winning. His neighbor, a blacksmith, had transformed 200 guilders into 1,800 in a single season, and the local baker was boasting of a new house purchased entirely with tulip profits. Jan's resistance did not crumble because of greed, but because of a paralyzing fear, the fear of being left behind, of being the only man in the Dutch Republic who failed to seize the greatest wealth generation event in history. Driven by this desperation, Jan sold his loom, his sole means of production, for 600 guilders and plunged every penny into tulip futures. His plan was disarmingly simple, a projection he considered conservative. He would buy futures, wait for the expected February peak, double his money to 1,200 guilders, and then buy an even better loom while keeping his original 600 in savings. He purchased contracts for 6 pounds of Switzer bulbs at 100 guilders per pound, due for delivery in June 1637. Like thousands of others, Jan had no intention of ever touching a physical bulb. He was simply holding a piece of paper he hoped to flip for a profit. Jan's entry into the market represented the final, most perilous phase of the mania, the arrival of the desperate money. By December 1636, the demographic composition of the market had shifted entirely. The smart money, the wealthy merchants who could afford to lose, had largely exited. In their place stood working-class individuals who had liquidated their life's tools and safety nets to gamble. This was a market of people who simply could not afford to be wrong. By this stage, tulip trading had migrated from the sober offices of merchants into the raucous atmosphere of local taverns, such as Het Vagele Anker. These venues functioned as chaotic, informal exchanges where deals involving thousands of guilders were struck over tankards of ale and amid clouds of tobacco smoke. Alcohol was deeply ingrained in the tradition of every transaction, meaning monumental financial obligations were frequently undertaken while participants were profoundly intoxicated. The environment was a sensory assault of competitive excitement and social pressure. Men crowded around grease-stained tables, shouting bids over scrawled scraps of paper that served as contracts. In this carnival atmosphere, the most dangerous innovation of the era emerged, the NAL, nearest and last system. In Dutch, NAL meant proxy, but in the taverns, it was pure gambling. It allowed participants to bet on price movements without ever owning or even intending to own the bulbs themselves, and one could bet 10 guilders that a price would rise by February. If correct, they took the stakes. This system effectively turned tulips into a pure abstraction. It attracted servants, laborers, and those previously priced out of the market, training them to view the tulip not as a flower, but as a ticker symbol. By January 1637, the disconnection from reality was total. The actual growers, the people who understood the horticultural value of tulips, had stopped participating because prices had become utterly detached from the cost of production. The market was now a closed loop of speculators trading with other speculators, none of whom possessed any expertise in bulbs. The price movements in January 1637 became truly parabolic. A pound of Switzers that cost 100 guilders in December surged to 900 by the end of January. Now, this was no longer a market, it was a fever. Yet, the most chilling aspect of this period was that nearly everyone involved knew it was insane. Diaries and letters from the time reveal that traders openly joked about the absurdity of the prices. They acknowledged that a flower was not worth a mansion, but they harbored a fatalistic confidence that they would be able to sell to someone else before the music stopped. Jan van Dijk and thousands like him were playing a high-stakes game of musical chairs. They watched the prices rise with a mixture of exhilaration and terror, each man convinced that his own reflexes were sharp enough to find a seat the moment the melody faltered. They were no longer investing in a nation's prosperity, and they were betting their very lives on the hope that the greater fool would remain in the room for just one more day. As individuals like Jan van Dijk were betting their lives on the last seat in the room itself was being rebuilt by a hidden shift in the rules, one that made the madness look, for a brief moment, terrifyingly logical. Chapter 5. The Rational Bubble, Earl Thompson and Sprout's Theory. By late January 1637, the mania reached escape velocity. It was no longer about flowers. It was about pure, unadulterated madness. On January 25th, A single Semper Augustus bulb sold for 5,500 guilders, plus a carriage and horses, totaling 6,000 guilders. That is the price of 2 luxury mansions for one route. In Haarlem, the madness reached a new low. Farmers weren't bidding on the rare Semper Augustus anymore. They were gambling on trash. They traded their livelihoods for what were called pound goods, common bulbs like Switzers or Witty Krunen, sold by weight, like onions. It wasn't about beauty anymore. It was a drinking game played with futures contracts. But wait, before we call them insane, we need to look at a theory that turns this whole story on its head. Economist Earl Thompson argues that this wasn't madness. It was a rational response to a change in the rules. In late 1636, rumors spread that the government was converting strict futures contracts into options contracts. This meant, if prices crashed, you wouldn't lose everything. You'd only pay a tiny 3.5% penalty fee. It was a risk-free bet. So naturally, people bid huge. But nature has a schedule. But if the government's rules provided the fuel for the fire, it was the cold, unyielding laws of nature that would finally provide the water. And this brings us to the sequestered capital theory. Throughout winter, the bulbs were hidden underground, but in early February, specifically in the warm, sandy soil of Haarlem, and the first green shoots began to sprout. When those sprouts appeared, the reality of supply was suddenly visible. The fantasy was over. The crash didn't happen randomly. It happened because the flowers literally showed up. As the first emerald tips pierced the soil of Haarlem, they acted as a silent starting pistol for a race that no one wanted to run. The race to the exit. Chapter 6. The Crash. February 1637. This brings us to the most important, haunting question. Why did the music stop? What specific event caused thousands of people, almost simultaneously, to decide that tulips were no longer valuable? The answer, as profound as it is simple, is that nothing specific caused it. There was no external shock, no war, no devastating plague, no governmental intervention, no widespread crop failure. The collapse happened simply because one day, a few individuals attempted to sell tulips and could not find buyers willing to pay the expected inflated price. It began in Haarlem on February 2nd, 1637. A tulip trader named Adriaan Pauw tried to sell a contract for 3-pound weights of Witterkruin bulbs, a moderately common variety, and he had paid 1,200 guilders for the contract just 2 weeks earlier and expected to sell it for at least 1,400 guilders based on the recent soaring price trends. But wait, why Haarlem? Why did the bubble burst there and not in the financial hub of Amsterdam? It wasn't random bad luck. It was biology and geography. Haarlem sits on a unique belt of sandy soil near the North Sea. This creates a specific microclimate that stays slightly warmer than the rest of the Dutch interior. Why does that matter? Because warmth triggers growth. The bulbs planted in Haarlem were likely the first in the entire country to sprout, while the rest of the Republic was still trading paper promises based on invisible, underground assets. Traders in Haarlem looked out their windows and saw green shoots breaking the surface, and the hidden supply was suddenly visible. They were the first to realize the fantasy was colliding with physical reality. He offered the contract in Het Golden Leeuw Tavern, a place where trading was typically exceptionally active. It was against this backdrop of sprouting reality that Adriaan Pauw stepped into the tavern, unknowingly carrying the first spark of the coming avalanche. The tavern, which moments ago was a cacophony of overlapping shouts, clinking tankards, and the feverish energy of men chasing fortunes, suddenly underwent a chilling transformation. As Pauw called out his initial price, the room buzzed with its usual frantic rhythm. But as he dropped the price again, and then again, a rhythmic silence began to radiate outward from his table like a cold front. The shouting died in throats, the laughter evaporated, and by the time he reached 1,200 guilders, the only sound left was the hollow thud of a single beer mug hitting wood and the crackle of the hearth. For the first time in years, the traders weren't looking at their contracts. They were looking at the exit, realized with a jolt of terror that the heir had finally left the room. No one bid. He lowered his asking price to 1,300 guilders. Still no buyers. He dropped it further to 1,200 guilders, the exact price he had paid, but there was no interest. Finally, in sheer frustration, he offered it at 1,100 guilders, desperate to take a loss just to convert the contract to much-needed cash. Someone eventually bought it for 900 guilders. Adrian Powell lost 300 guilders, a quarter of his investment, in a devastating transaction. Word of this calamitous sale spread through Harlem's tight-knit trading network within mere hours. If Vitorkran contracts were now selling below recent prices, what did that ominous development signify for other varieties? If one trader was forced to absorb such a significant loss, were there other sellers lurking, unable to find buyers at their expected prices? The very next day, February 3rd, several other traders, gripped by mounting panic, attempted to sell their contracts, desperate to lock in their paper profits before prices fell even further. But the only way to lock in profits was to find buyers. And suddenly, mysteriously, buyers were nowhere to be found. Every single trader had the exact same terrifying idea simultaneously. Sell now before prices drop further. But if everyone is selling, who, then, is buying? This, you see, is precisely how bubbles invariably end. Not with a resounding bang, but with the sudden, deafening absence of greater fools. The entire fragile structure of the tulip market was predicated upon the false assumption that there would always be someone, somewhere, willing to pay more than you did. When that fundamental assumption proved tragically false, when sellers could no longer find buyers, the market didn't merely decline, it froze completely. By February 5th, trading in Harlem had ceased entirely. Not because it was legally prohibited, but because it had become utterly impossible. No one at any price would buy. Sellers offering contracts at a steep 50% discount found zero takers. The market had spiraled from frenzied overactivity to absolute, terrifying paralysis in just 72 hours. The mania's final and most insane phase, the peak of valuation, had lasted precisely 5 weeks, from Christmas 1636 to early February 1637. And now it was over. Not a gradual winding down, but a complete, instantaneous cessation. But the devastating consequences were just beginning to unfold. As the market froze in a dead silence, the cold numbers on the ledgers transformed into a suffocating reality for those who had staked everything on the music never stopping. Chapter 7. The Aftermath. Paradox, True Misery, False History. Price Explosion, February 6, 1637. John Van Dyck, the Harlem weaver who had so tragically sold his loom to buy tulip futures, realized with crushing finality that his 600 guilder investment was now utterly worthless. He had purchased contracts for 6-pound weights of Switzer's bulbs at 100 guilders per pound on December 15th. By January 31st, those very same bulbs were trading at an unbelievable 900 guilders per pound. His initial 600 guilder investment had swelled to a staggering 5,400 guilders on paper. He had, on paper, made 4,800 guilders in profit, more money than he would earn in 19 years of backbreaking weaving. Except, he hadn't actually made anything at all, because he hadn't sold. Like thousands of other deluded speculators, Adjan had watched the price rise and thought, I'll sell when it hits 1,000 per pound. Then it reached 900 and he thought just a little more, it'll definitely reach 1,000. On February 5th, Jan, desperate, attempted to liquidate his position at 800 guilders per pound. While still representing a significant theoretical profit, he found no willing buyers. Dropping his asking price to 600 guilders, just enough to recoup his initial investment, he again faced an empty market. Even at 300 guilders, a devastating loss, not a single buyer emerged. By February 6th, the market price for Switzer's bulbs had effectively plummeted to zero. This wasn't because the bulbs themselves held no intrinsic value. They were still viable and would produce flowers, but rather because the market for tulip futures contracts had completely evaporated, and no one would engage in transactions at any price. The market's complete cessation had profound personal implications for Jan. He had sold his loom, his sole means of livelihood, for 600 guilders. This entire sum was then invested in contracts that were now utterly unsaleable. He was left with no income, no savings, no tangible assets, and a wife and 3 children entirely dependent on him. Tragically, Jan's plight was far from unique. Thousands across the Dutch Republic found themselves in equally dire circumstances. However, Jan's problems extended beyond merely losing his investment. He hadn't simply purchased futures contracts, he had explicitly signed them, thereby legally obligating himself to pay 600 guilders when the bulbs were delivered in June. The seller of these contracts, a grower named Willem Jans, had remained legally entitled to that payment. The collapse of tulip prices did not, in any way, void Jan's contractual obligation. This is the critical, often perilous, characteristic of futures contracts. Buyers risk not just their initial payment, but also create a binding legal commitment to pay the full contract price upon delivery, irrespective of market fluctuations in the interim. Consequently, Jan was beholden to Willem for 600 guilders in June, for bulbs that had become entirely worthless. Given his inability to pay, having sold his loom and possessing no income, Willem could sue Jan for breach of contract. A magistrate would undoubtedly order Jan to pay, and upon his inevitable failure to do so, his remaining possessions would be seized and sold to partially cover the debt. Jan would then face imprisonment for the outstanding balance. This wasn't a hypothetical legal threat. It became a stark reality across the Dutch Republic in February 1637. The collapse of the tulip market triggered a devastating cascade of legal and financial crises. Each futures contract represented a buyer who owed money and a seller who expected it. When prices fell, buyers were unable to pay because their strategy relied on selling those contracts at a profit to generate the necessary cash. But with no buyers to be found, they defaulted on their obligations. These defaults by buyers meant sellers never received the payments they had been counting on. Many sellers, in turn, had leveraged their anticipated tulip earnings as collateral for other loans. When the expected tulip money failed to materialize, and they defaulted on their own loans, this, in turn, meant their creditors did not receive payment, leading those creditors to default on their own obligations. This chain reaction is known as a credit cascade, and it's precisely what transforms a localized market collapse into a full-blown economic crisis. The tulip market was not an isolated phenomenon. It was intricately interwoven with the broader Dutch economy through countless credit relationships. As tulips failed, everything connected to them began to unravel. By February 10th, Amsterdam's notaries were inundated with an unprecedented flood of lawsuits. Creditors pursued buyers who had defaulted on tulip contracts. Buyers, often with no legal basis, sued sellers for having sold them worthless contracts, overlooking that sellers had committed no fraud. And business partners even sued each other for unauthorized use of partnership funds to purchase tulips. Amsterdam's magistrates quickly grasped the impossible dilemma before them. They could enforce every tulip contract as written, which would inevitably bankrupt thousands of families and risked destabilizing the entire economy. Alternatively, they could void the contracts, an action that would effectively reward defaulters while unjustly penalizing those who had striven to honor their commitments. In mid-February, the Amsterdam City Council convened an emergency session to address the escalating tulip contract disputes. The council was deeply divided. Some members vehemently argued that contracts were sacrosanct and that voiding them would irrevocably erode trust in all commercial agreements, and others contended that strict enforcement would plunge society into chaos, deeming it absurd to imprison thousands of otherwise law-abiding citizens for failing to pay for valueless flower bulbs. Ultimately, the council arrived at a compromise. Tulip contracts signed after November 1636 could be canceled by paying a settlement fee equivalent to 3.5% of the contract's original value. For example, an obligation to pay 1,000 guilders for tulips in June could be nullified by a payment of just 35 guilders. This compromise was intended to strike a delicate balance between justice and pragmatism. Buyers would absorb a small loss from the 3.5% fee, but avoid catastrophic debt, while sellers would receive some compensation rather than nothing. The hope was that this would stabilize the economy, and instead it exacerbated the problems. The compromise's limited scope, applying only to contracts signed after November 1636, left earlier contracts fully enforceable. This arbitrary distinction created two distinct classes of tulip debtors, some who could escape relatively cheaply, and others who faced full, ruinous liability. It also introduced perverse incentives. If you had signed a contract in October 1636, owing 2,000 guilders for now worthless bulbs, you were still liable for the full amount. The 3.5% settlement option was unavailable to you. Your only choices were to pay the impossible sum, attempt a difficult private negotiation with a seller who was likely also in financial distress, or flee, a path many ultimately took. And the Amsterdam Council fundamentally failed to grasp that the tulip collapse wasn't primarily a legal problem. It was a crisis of confidence. The entire Dutch commercial economy thrived on an intricate web of trust and credit. Merchants routinely extended credit to one another based on reputation and established performance. This delicate system functioned because participants generally honored their obligations. The Tulip Mania, however, had spawned an enormous volume of obligations that simply could not be honored. The Council's compromised solution did not restore confidence. It merely sowed further confusion about which obligations held sway and which did not. This pervasive uncertainty brought credit markets to a standstill. If you were a merchant considering extending credit to a buyer, how could you possibly know if they weren't still burdened by tulip debts that might suddenly come due? You couldn't. And so, credit dried up. By March 1637, the Dutch Republic's commercial economy was seizing up. This was not due to a halt in production. Farms still yielded crops, workshops still produced goods, and ships continued to ply trade routes. Instead, it was because the vital credit relationships that lubricated all these activities had fractured. Without credit, transactions that were typically smooth and routine became difficult, if not impossible. A baker, accustomed to buying flour on credit and paying the miller monthly, could no longer secure credit because the miller no longer trusted the baker's ability to pay. The baker, consequently, couldn't produce bread, which meant no revenue, confirming the miller's initial distrust. This self-fulfilling credit freeze propagated rapidly through the economy. Amazingly, while personal fortunes were destroyed, the nation itself kept sailing. But here is the great irony of the Tulip Mania. While the tragedy was devastatingly real for men like Jan, for the nation of the Netherlands, it was barely a ripple in the ocean of their golden age. The ships didn't stop. The golden age didn't end. Why? Because no real money had changed hands, only paper promises. It was a crisis of the mind, not the wallet. But for individuals like John van Dyck, the damage was psychological. He wasn't starving, but he was stuck in a legal limbo, shamed by his community, a cautionary tale of what happens when you mistake a game for reality. By April 1637, unemployment in major Dutch cities had approximately doubled from pre-tulip levels. Charitable institutions, churches, and guilds, which traditionally supported the poor, were utterly overwhelmed by the sheer number of people seeking assistance. Compounding the problem, these very institutions faced their own financial strains, as their donors and members were also under severe economic stress. The Dutch government eventually intervened in late February, though its actions proved to be limited and largely ineffective. The national government, or the States General, lacked the authority to override local courts on matters of contract law. They could issue guidelines and recommendations, but they could not compel magistrates to handle cases in any specific manner. As a result, different cities adopted disparate approaches. Amsterdam, for instance, voided most tulip contracts signed after November 1636, allowing for settlement at just 3.5% of their face value. Haarlem, however, adopted a stricter stance, largely enforcing contracts, but permitting extended payment plans. Utrecht attempted to broker collective settlements where all parties agreed to proportional losses. This fragmented, inconsistent response spawned bizarre inequities. Two individuals with identical tulip obligations could face entirely different consequences depending on which city's courts held jurisdiction over their case. Someone in Amsterdam might escape with a mere 3.5% payment, while another in Haarlem was held fully liable for their massive debts. These profound injustices ignited widespread social unrest. The burning question was, why should one's geography determine whether they faced financial ruin or merely a minor setback? Anger was largely directed at wealthy merchants, many of whom had shrewdly exited the tulip market early, their profits intact. Mobs began to form in several cities, targeting the homes and businesses of suspected profiteers. The most severe riot unfolded in Haarlem on March 18, 1637. An estimated crowd of 800 people, comprising unemployed workers, bankrupted shopkeepers, and others devastated by the tulip collapse, marched to the city hall, demanding debt forgiveness. When magistrates refused to meet with them, the frustrated crowd lashed out, attacking the homes of several wealthy merchants, smashing windows, and looting their contents. Authorities swiftly responded with force. Soldiers arrested over 50 rioters, 5 of whom were publicly flogged as a stark warning. While the immediate violence subsided, the underlying tension and resentment persisted. The Tulip Mania had left behind a populace of angry, desperate individuals who felt profoundly betrayed by a system that appeared to protect the wealthy while punishing ordinary citizens. What made the social impact particularly severe was that many had lost not just their money, but also their very identity and social standing. A master craftsman who had dedicated 2 decades to building his reputation and business might suddenly lose his workshop, his tools, his independence, and be reduced to the ignominy of working as a day laborer. He had been stripped of not only his wealth, but also his place in society, his pride, and his fundamental sense of self-worth. And court records and personal letters from 1637 to 1640 tragically document dozens of suicides directly attributed to tulip-related financial ruin. These were individuals who simply could not face a life utterly devoid of everything they had worked for. Importantly, these were not people who had been poor beforehand. They were individuals who had achieved modest success and security, only to gamble it all on tulips and lose everything. The psychological toll extended far beyond those directly ruined. Every Dutch citizen had witnessed the mania unfold, observing neighbors grow rich only to be utterly destroyed. They had collectively experienced a massive delusion playing out in real time. This created a profound and lasting distrust of speculation and financial markets, and a characteristic that would define Dutch culture for generations to come. By the summer of 1637, the immediate crisis showed signs of moderating. Courts had processed the bulk of lawsuits, settlements had been reached, and the economy began a slow, tentative recovery. However, this recovery was both incomplete and uneven. While some individuals and industries rebounded quickly, many others never fully recovered. The actual tulip growers, those who cultivated the bulbs, were hit hard, but ultimately survived. They retained their land and their specialized expertise. They shifted their focus back to growing tulips as ornamental flowers for gardens, rather than as speculative financial instruments. The tulip industry contracted significantly, by roughly 75%, but it did not vanish entirely. Conversely, textile workers who had lost their looms and workshops faced a much harder struggle. many never regained their former positions, instead joining the ranks of casual laborers, working intermittently for meager wages and never rebuilding the security they had once enjoyed. Even tavern owners, who had hosted much of the frenzied tulip trading, faced consequences. Several were prosecuted for facilitating gambling, which was illegal under Dutch law. Authorities, eager to find scapegoats for the disaster, found convenient targets in the visible, somewhat culpable tavern owners, who often lacked the resources for expensive legal defense. Yet, prosecuting tavern owners did not address the fundamental questions. How did an entire society convince itself that flower bulbs were worth more than houses? How did thousands of intelligent, educated, and inexperienced people succumb to such a widespread collective delusion? And, most importantly, how could future generations prevent such a phenomenon from recurring? These questions remained unanswered in 1637, and indeed, for centuries thereafter, despite the Tulip Mania becoming the quintessential historical example of speculative bubble psychology. The uncomfortable truth is that the very conditions that fueled the Tulip Mania, abundant capital, limited investment options, early success stories, social pressure, leverage, and an unwavering belief in perpetual price appreciation reappear with striking regularity. While the specific asset changes, be it tulips, stocks, real estate, or cryptocurrency, the underlying pattern tragically remains the same. Each time, participants are convinced that this time is different, and believing the current boom is rooted in genuine value, not mere speculation. That the laws of economics have somehow been suspended, and that prices will continue their ascent due to some unique, unrepeatable circumstance. The Dutch of 1637 learned this lesson at an enormous cost. The economic damage took years to fully repair. The social damage lingered even longer, and the psychological trauma, the collective shock of watching wealth vanish, permanently altered Dutch culture. Yet, the most crucial lesson, that bubbles are inevitable, that they invariably collapse, and that their collapse is always more destructive than participants anticipate, was forgotten as soon as the pain began to fade. Within 50 years, a new generation would eagerly participate in fresh speculative manias, convinced they had learned from history, and yet doomed to repeat its mistakes. Indeed, by the summer of 1637, amidst the desperate aftermath, the very tulip bulbs that had wrought such financial destruction were blooming magnificently in gardens across the Dutch Republic. The Semper Augustus bulbs, those legendary white tulips with striking red flames that had commanded prices of 6,000 guilders in January, produced their spectacular flowers in May and June exactly as they always had. The flowers were undeniably beautiful, lasting a fleeting 2 to 3 weeks before gracefully fading, leaving only the bulbs underground to propagate for the following year. This created a surreal paradox. The physical tulips, the root cause of the economic catastrophe, were performing precisely as tulips always had. They bloomed, they faded, they produced offspring. And none of the speculation had altered the fundamental nature of tulips. They remained seasonal flowers with modest propagation rates and a pleasant, albeit temporary, visual appeal. Growers who had sold bulbs at peak prices in January observed those same varieties bloom in June and arrived at a profound realization. The bulbs were no more special after the bubble than they had been before. A Viceroy tulip that sold for 4,500 guilders in January produced the exact same flower as a Viceroy bulb that had been bought for 600 guilders in 1635. The flower, impervious to human valuation, simply bloomed according to its genetic programming. This fundamental disconnect between market price and underlying reality is, in essence, the defining characteristic of all bubbles. An asset, whether it be tulips, stocks, real estate, or cryptocurrency, possesses some inherent value based on what it does or produces. However, during a bubble, its market price becomes completely divorced from this actual value. Price then reflects not what the asset is truly worth, but rather what people believe others will be willing to pay for it. The aftermath compelled Dutch society to confront an uncomfortable question. If tulips had always been merely flowers, what, then, had the speculative frenzy truly been about? The answer, it became clear, was psychological, not economic. The Tulip Mania had been fueled by the intoxicating dream of easy wealth, the fervent desire to escape one's economic class through a clever investment rather than through decades of arduous labor, the palpable fear of missing out while others prospered, and the overwhelming social pressure to participate in what everyone else was doing. In short, it was about human nature itself. And that is why the Tulip Mania remains relevant, far beyond being a mere historical curiosity. It unveiled fundamental psychological patterns that consistently drive speculative behavior in any era, irrespective of the specific asset involved. By late 1637, the extensive efforts to resolve the thousands of disputed tulip contracts had largely concluded. The outcomes varied wildly, influenced by factors such as geographical location, the parties involved, and even the sheer luck of which magistrate heard a particular case. Some buyers who had signed contracts for thousands of guilders were able to escape their massive liabilities by paying a 3.5% settlement fee, and a mere 35 guilders on a 1,000 guilder contract. While they lost their modest initial investments, they successfully avoided catastrophic debt. Other buyers, particularly those in cities that strictly enforced contracts or those whose agreements predated November 1636, faced full liability. Many of them simply could not pay and consequently lost everything: their homes, businesses, and life savings. Some endured years in debtor's prison, while a few even fled the country to escape their obligations. Sellers, too, experienced equally varied outcomes. Some received their full contract prices, especially if they had sold to wealthy buyers who could afford to honor their commitments, even as tulip values plummeted. Others received settlement payments amounting to only a few % of their contract value, while many received nothing at all and were forced to absorb total losses. This sheer randomness of who was utterly destroyed and who managed to survive bred a profound sense of injustice that poisoned Dutch society for years. Individuals who had made almost identical decisions, buying tulip futures in late 1636, could end up with drastically different outcomes based on factors entirely beyond their control. This felt fundamentally unfair in a way that typical business failures did not. If you opened a shop that failed because of a poor location or unpopular goods, you could accept that as your own mistake. But if you bought tulip futures alongside thousands of others, making the exact same decision, and you ended up bankrupt while others escaped with minor losses, where was the justice in that? This question had no satisfactory answer. The Tulip Mania had been a collective event, yet its consequences were profoundly individual. Society proved incapable of distributing the pain evenly, meaning some individuals bore crushing burdens, while others walked away relatively unscathed. The tulip growers, those who had actually cultivated the bulbs, confronted a different challenge. They still possessed substantial inventory, fields brimming with tulip bulbs that had been worth millions of guilders in January, yet were now almost worthless. What should they do with them? Some growers, in a fit of frustration or disgust, simply destroyed their bulbs. If tulips had caused such immense damage, why continue cultivating them? It seemed more sensible to plant something useful, like wheat or vegetables. Records indeed mention several large tulip fields being plowed under, and their bulbs simply annihilated. Other growers, however, retained their bulbs and pivoted their business models. Instead of selling to volatile speculators, they chose to sell to gardeners who genuinely desired flowers. This market still existed. Wealthy collectors continued to appreciate beautiful tulips. While the prices were significantly lower, the demand was real and stable. This strategic shift back to fundamentals stabilized the tulip market, albeit at a far lower level. By 1640, tulips were trading at roughly 1% to 2% of their peak 1637 prices. A viceroy bulb that had fetched 4,500 guilders in January 1637 might sell for 60 guilders in 1640, Still expensive compared to common flowers, perhaps, but now firmly within the range of normal luxury goods rather than insane speculation. The Dutch East India Company, which had been peripherally affected by the Tulip Mania, some of its employees and investors had speculated, conducted an internal review in 1638. Its aim was to understand what had transpired and to devise strategies to prevent future speculative disasters. Their report, remarkably preserved in company archives, offers profound insights. It identified several key contributing factors: an abundance of capital actively seeking returns, the pervasive social pressure to participate in perceived successful trends, the extensive use of leverage through futures contracts, and the widespread belief that prices would continue to rise indefinitely. The report recommended that the company prohibit employees from trading in speculative markets unrelated to company business, limit the use of credit for non-essential purposes, and maintain substantial cash reserves to withstand future economic shocks. These were sensible precautions, though they were not designed to prevent future bubbles in the wider economy. They merely aimed to insulate the company from direct involvement. By the early 1640s, the Dutch economy had largely recovered from the tulip collapse. Trade volumes returned to pre-mania levels, employment normalized, and credit markets unfroze as trust was gradually rebuilt. The immediate crisis had passed, yet certain changes proved permanent. The Dutch Republic never again exhibited the same enthusiastic embrace of financial innovation that characterized the early 1630s. New financial instruments and markets were subsequently viewed with deep suspicion. Speculation became culturally stigmatized, whereas in the 1620s and early 1630s, aggressive traders were admired. By the 1640s, they were seen as dangerous gamblers. This pervasive cultural conservatism likely prevented some future manias, but it also inadvertently cost the Dutch Republic valuable opportunities. While financial innovation is inherently risky, it is also a vital engine for economic growth and adaptation. By becoming excessively conservative, the Dutch may have inadvertently slowed their own economic development in the later 17th century. Consider the individuals who directly lived through the mania. Those who were young adults in 1637, in their 20s or early 30s, carried the indelible memory of the tulip collapse for the remainder of their lives. They recounted the events to their children and grandchildren, employing it as a potent cautionary tale. Don't chase quick money, and don't believe in easy wealth. Don't follow the crowd into speculation. This generational trauma deeply shaped Dutch culture for decades. However, memories inevitably fade. By the 1660s and 1670s, a new generation had emerged, having grown up hearing about the Tulip Mania as a historical event rather than experiencing it personally. And, true to human nature, they began to wonder if perhaps the older generation had overreacted. Perhaps tulips had been a unique anomaly. Perhaps modern markets were different. This is the recurring cycle that plays out after every financial crisis. Those who endure it become conservative and risk-averse, warning the next generation. But the subsequent generation, not having directly experienced the pain, gradually forgets these hard-won lessons. They begin taking risks once more, and eventually, they create their own crisis, learning the very same lessons their elders had tried to impart. The Tulip Mania was simply the first documented instance of this cyclical pattern. It would certainly not be the last. By 1650, a Dutch artist named Jan Bruegel the Younger created a biting satire of the Tulip Mania, famously depicting monkeys in elaborate clothes trading tulips. The painting served as a commentary on the utter folly of the speculation, equating tulip traders to mindless animals thoughtlessly following each other. The artwork was popular and widely copied, becoming one of the defining artistic images of the Tulip Mania. Yet, here's what's intriguing. By the time the painting was created, the tulip collapse was already 13 years in the past. It was being transformed from a lived, painful experience into a historical symbol, and symbols, unlike complex realities, can be simplified and easily misunderstood. The Tulip Mania was becoming a captivating story about Dutch people succumbing to madness over flowers. A mere curiosity, an aberration, something that couldn't happen again because people simply wouldn't be that foolish. For centuries, we have been told that this mania destroyed the Dutch economy. Textbooks speak of a 10% GDP collapse and a nation in ruin. Modern historians, digging into the actual archives, have found nothing. Historian Anne Goldgar found remarkably few bankruptcies. Why? Because the trading wasn't happening between poor chimney sweeps and ignorant farmers, as the legends say. It was mostly a closed loop of wealthy merchants who could afford to lose. The Dutch Golden Age didn't end, yet the economy kept booming. So why do we believe the apocalypse story? Because of propaganda. Calvinist preachers wanted you to believe it. They exaggerated the ruin to warn people against greed. The Tulip Mania we know isn't a financial record. It's a 400-year-old moral fable that we mistook for history. But here is the twist that changes everything. For nearly 400 years, we have told this story as a warning about the stupidity of the masses. We've pictured chimney sweeps and weavers like Jan van Dijk betting their life savings on a single route. But modern historians, like Anne Goldgar, have recently gone back to the actual archives from the 1630s, and they found something shocking. Most of the mania might actually be fake news. When researchers dug into the bankruptcy records of 1637, they couldn't find the mass ruin we've been told about. There were remarkably few bankruptcies directly linked to tulips. Why? Because the trading wasn't happening between poor chimney sweeps and ignorant farmers. It was a closed loop of wealthy merchants, people who could afford to lose. And that economic collapse? The Dutch Golden Age didn't end. The economy kept booming. So, where did the horror stories come from? It turns out they were largely propaganda. Calvinist preachers at the time hated the idea of something for nothing. They exaggerated these stories into moral fables to warn against greed and ungodly wealth. Later, writers like Charles Mackay picked up these pamphlets and presented them as historical fact, creating the myth of a nationwide delirium. So, while the prices were real, and the destruction of society was likely a 17th century moral panic, amplified by history's telephone game. But even if the economic destruction was a myth spun by preachers, the physical reality left a ghost that no historian could ignore. A beauty so extreme, it effectively erased itself from the earth. Chapter 8. Extinction and Legacy. So, the Dutch economy survived. The ships kept sailing. But there is one thing that didn't survive. Remember the Semper Augustus? That legendary bulb with the red and white flames, worth the price of a grand mansion? You cannot buy one today. In fact, you can't even see one. It is extinct. As we now know, the mosaic virus that created those stunning patterns was a parasite. It was biologically contradictory. It made the flower beautiful, but it was slowly starving the bulb. Generation after generation, the broken tulips grew weaker, smaller, and frailer, until they simply stopped growing altogether. The most valuable object in the 17th century world didn't just crash in price, it physically ceased to exist. All that remains of that immense fortune are a few old paintings, the ghosts of a flower that was quite literally too beautiful to live. This popular interpretation completely missed the fundamental point. The disappearance of the Semper Augustus was the final proof that value cannot be sustained by desire alone. It requires a foundation in reality, a lesson that human psychology, unfortunately, is wired to reject. The Tulip Mania was not about tulips, nor was it about some unique Dutch peculiarity. It was about universal human psychology in the grip of speculative mania. The specific details, what was being traded, where it happened, when it occurred, were almost irrelevant. The underlying pattern was what truly mattered. But that pattern would not be properly recognized for what it was for another 3 centuries. And it was not until modern economists and psychologists systematically studied financial bubbles that the recurring nature of these events became clear. And even then, the lesson is perpetually forgotten. For here is the uncomfortable truth that the Tulip Mania so starkly revealed. Humans are not rational economic actors. We are emotional, social, imitative creatures who make decisions based on the stories we tell ourselves rather than objective analysis. And no amount of historical knowledge prevents us from falling victim to the same patterns when circumstances align once more. The Dutch learned this painful lesson in 1637. We, it seems, are still learning it today. Gross domestic product, by its very nature, is designed to measure production and exchange. It simply does not and cannot capture the profound spectrum of human suffering. And consider the individual who lost his flourishing business due to the mania and was forced to become a mere day laborer. He might still be working, still producing some value, and thus still contributing to GDP. However, he has simultaneously lost his hard-earned independence, his social status, his financial security, and perhaps most cruelly, his cherished hope for the future. These immeasurable personal losses, though absent from economic statistics, were undeniably devastatingly real. Beyond individual tragedies, the social fabric itself suffered. Countless families were utterly destroyed, lives were tragically ended by suicide, and innocent children grew up mired in poverty because their parents had lost everything they possessed to the tulip craze. Communities lost their fundamental cohesion as neighbors turned on each other, and assigning blame for participation in or encouragement of the rampant speculation. None of these deeply painful and pervasive consequences ever appear in GDP figures. Yet, they represented the authentic, heartbreaking cost of the Tulip Mania. By 1650, remarkably, the Dutch economy had largely recovered its impressive growth trajectory. The devastating tulip collapse was already receding, slowly fading into the annals of history. However, the individuals who had personally endured its harsh realities carried deep, often invisible scars that never fully healed. And, perhaps most lamentably, the critical lessons that should have been indelibly etched into societal consciousness, lessons about the inherent dangers of speculative manias, the cyclical nature of bubbles, the vulnerabilities of human psychology, and the deceptive allure of seemingly easy wealth, were, alarmingly, already being forgotten. Indeed, within just a single generation, strikingly similar patterns of speculative excess would tragically re-emerge across Europe. First in England with the infamous South Sea Company bubble, then in France with the Mississippi Company, and even again in Holland itself with various canal company schemes. Each successive time, people would optimistically declare, "This time is different," convinced that their circumstances were unique and immune. And each time, they would be demonstrably wrong. The Tulip Mania, it turned out, was not an anomaly. It was merely the template. Every speculative frenzy that followed was, in essence, simply a variation on this fundamental theme, a stark historical warning repeatedly unheeded. The Tulip Mania, however, entered the broader historical consciousness rather slowly and often incompletely. Furthermore, the few lessons that did manage to endure were frequently the mistaken ones. In the immediate aftermath, during the 1640s and 1650s, the catastrophic tulip collapse was primarily dismissed as a peculiar Dutch eccentricity, a unique cultural failing. Indeed, contemporary English and French observers recounted the events with a palpable mixture of horror and self-congratulatory superiority. Their commentary often echoed sentiments such as, "Look how those utterly irrational Dutch lost their minds over mere flowers. How foolish, how utterly un-English or un-French such behavior truly was. We, of course, would never succumb to anything so absurd." This dismissive interpretation, while undoubtedly comforting to their national pride, was, in fact, an entirely and profoundly wrong. The truth, however, was far removed from national character. The Tulip Mania was never about a unique Dutch irrationality. Rather, it was a potent demonstration of universal human psychology when exposed to the intense pressures of a speculative mania. The fact that this particular phenomenon first erupted in the Netherlands was less about any inherent foolishness of its people and far more a testament to their advanced financial sophistication. The Dutch Republic at that time possessed the sophisticated capital markets and complex credit instruments uniquely necessary to incubate and inflate such a large-scale financial bubble. Indeed, by the 1670s and 1680s, both England and France found themselves grappling with their own distinct, yet disturbingly similar, speculative manias. The underlying pattern, chillingly, was almost identical to the Tulip episode, a novel financial instrument, in England's case, joint stock companies, and in France's, lucrative overseas trading concessions, would attract a torrent of eager investment. As prices soared, speculation intensified dramatically. Leverage amplified the potential gains and losses, and eventually, with predictable and devastating consequences, the inevitable bubble would burst. The South Sea Company bubble in England in 1720 proved to be a particularly instructive, albeit painful, historical parallel. Share prices for the company skyrocketed from a baseline of 100 units to well over 1,000 units in a mere matter of months, only to then precipitously collapse back to their original 100-unit value within weeks. This catastrophic downturn ruined thousands of investors and inflicted severe economic damage, and crucially, exhibited a psychological pattern identical to that of the Tulip Mania. Initial rapid success breeds intoxicating confidence. Subsequently, social pressure powerfully drives widespread participation. Leverage dramatically amplifies both potential gains and crushing losses. And then, inevitably, collapse occurs with stunning suddenness once that fragile confidence finally shatters. You see, this is the immutable pattern that relentlessly repeats itself across history. While the specific asset being speculated upon inevitably changes, be it tulips, company shares, real estate, tech stocks, mortgage-backed securities, or even cryptocurrency, the underlying human psychology driving the phenomenon remains remarkably constant. And the cycle typically begins when early adopters manage to secure substantial, real profits. This success, in turn, irresistibly attracts a wave of imitators. As more participants flood in, prices continue to climb, generating even more profits for those who joined later, and thereby drawing in an ever larger crowd. These escalating prices are then often rationalized by proponents as reflecting some new, genuine, intrinsic value. Leverage is employed to further amplify returns, and social pressure becomes so intense that non-participation becomes psychologically painful, akin to missing out on an undeniable opportunity. This frenetic activity continues until, inevitably, something triggers the first flicker of doubt. Once doubt takes root, confidence collapses with breathtaking speed. In a frantic attempt to escape, and everyone tries to sell their holdings simultaneously, leading to an inevitable, catastrophic price crash. Economists have meticulously studied this recurring pattern, particularly since behavioral economics emerged as a distinct field in the late 20th century. Their research has pinpointed several specific cognitive biases that consistently drive bubble behavior. Among these is recency bias, the deeply ingrained human tendency to believe that recent trends, especially positive ones, will simply continue indefinitely into the future. During the Tulip Mania, for instance, people observed 3 years of spectacular price increases and irrationally extrapolated them forward, assuming this growth would simply continue forever. Another key bias is herd behavior, where individuals make decisions primarily based on what others are doing, and rather than engaging in independent, critical analysis. If everyone is buying tulips and seemingly profiting, it can feel entirely rational, even imperative, to join the crowd. Then there's confirmation bias, the human inclination to seek out and prioritize information that confirms existing beliefs, while actively dismissing or ignoring any contradictory evidence. Tulip traders, for example, would eagerly latch on to lucrative success stories while conveniently dismissing any warnings as mere jealousy or sheer ignorance. Another significant factor is availability bias, which involves overweighting information that is easily accessible, vivid, or memorable. Hearing about a neighbor's sudden, spectacular tulip profits, for instance, would influence decision-making far more powerfully than abstract discussions of market risks. Finally, a loss aversion describes the psychological phenomenon where the pain of a potential loss feels far more intense than the pleasure derived from an equivalent gain. This powerful bias often manifests as individuals holding on to losing assets for far too long, stubbornly refusing to sell until they have recouped their full initial investment, even when such a recovery becomes demonstrably impossible. These deeply ingrained cognitive biases are, in essence, hardwired into universal human psychology. While they likely evolved for entirely valid reasons in ancestral environments, they frequently cause significant problems within the complexities of modern financial markets. Crucially, simply knowing about these biases on an intellectual level does not inherently prevent them from subtly, yet powerfully, and influencing our behavior and decision-making. Indeed, virtually every professional trader and seasoned economist intellectually comprehends these biases. Yet, despite this widespread knowledge, speculative bubbles continue to form and, inevitably, to burst. Therefore, the single most crucial and profound lesson to be gleaned from the Tulip Mania, the one that should have fundamentally altered how societies perceive and interact with financial markets, is this stark realization: bubbles are, in essence, inevitable. They are not mere aberrations or isolated incidents signaling unusual foolishness on the part of participants. Rather, bubbles represent a predictable and recurring consequence of intrinsic human psychology interacting with the fertile ground of speculative markets. And this pivotal understanding shifts the fundamental question from how do we prevent bubbles from forming to the far more pragmatic and essential inquiry: how do we effectively minimize the widespread damage when they inevitably burst? The answer to this critical question, it turns out, involves several interconnected components. One vital component is limiting leverage. The Tulip Mania was catastrophic, in large part because participants extensively used credit to finance their tulip purchases. Had all transactions strictly required cash payment, individual losses would have been naturally limited to only the money actually invested. Leverage, by its very design, has the power to transform otherwise manageable losses into utterly devastating bankruptcies for individuals and businesses alike. And a second critical element is maintaining clear separation between speculative endeavors and essential economic activity. When tulip contracts became deeply integrated into the broader economy, used as collateral for vital loans, or even accepted as payment for everyday goods, their eventual collapse inflicted severe damage upon countless individuals who had never even chosen to speculate directly. Keeping speculative markets isolated, therefore, significantly limits the potential for widespread contagion throughout the wider economy. A third crucial component is preserving the integrity and quality of information. During the height of the Tulip Mania, accurate price information was notoriously unreliable and often deliberately manipulated. Different taverns might report wildly divergent prices for the same bulbs, and contracts were frequently not properly recorded or legally binding, and verifying claims was exceedingly difficult. While improved information quality certainly cannot prevent bubbles altogether, it can at least render them slightly less extreme and chaotic. A fourth, and perhaps most humane component, is building robust social safety nets. The most utterly devastating consequences of the tulip collapse disproportionately fell upon those individuals who lost absolutely everything they owned and, heartbreakingly, had no existing support system to fall back on. Societies equipped with superior unemployment insurance, comprehensive bankruptcy protection, and a wider array of social services are significantly better positioned to absorb the shocks of bubble bursts with considerably less widespread human suffering. However, and here lies the uncomfortable, inconvenient truth, Even with all these thoughtfully designed protections in place, speculative bubbles still inevitably form, and people still, regrettably, get hurt. This is because the fundamental underlying dynamics, the innate human desire for quick wealth, the powerful social pressure to conform, and the often unwavering belief in perpetually continued growth simply cannot be eliminated without dismantling market capitalism itself. The Tulip Mania thus became the canonical historical example of speculative excess, a cautionary tale against which every subsequent major financial bubble has inevitably been measured. During periods of rampant boom, commentators frequently warn, "This is getting as crazy as the Tulip Mania," to which, typically, enthusiastic participants will confidently retort, "Oh, but we're not like those foolish Dutch with their mere flowers. This time is truly different." This ubiquitous comparison, while often made, is simultaneously both apt and insufficient. It is profoundly apt because the underlying patterns of human behavior and market dynamics are genuinely, even astonishingly, similar. The fundamental psychology driving bubble formation and their subsequent collapse has, in essence, remained unchanged for 4 centuries. However, the comparison is also insufficient because each successive bubble possesses its own unique characteristics and nuances that make direct, perfect comparisons somewhat imperfect. The Tulip Mania, for instance, involved a physical commodity, a flower bulb, that undeniably possessed genuine aesthetic value and rarity. Let's reflect then, and on what the Tulip Mania should have profoundly taught future generations, but regrettably, largely did not. First, that price increases alone do not inherently indicate increased intrinsic value. Tulips surging from 100 to 1,000 guilders certainly didn't make them 10 times more beautiful or useful. They simply made them 10 times more expensive. Second, that leverage amplifies losses just as effectively, and often more devastatingly, as it amplifies gains. Borrowed money may spectacularly multiply returns on the upward trajectory, but it just as swiftly devastates portfolios and lives on the inevitable downward spiral. Third, that social proof is emphatically not factual evidence. The fact that everyone seemed to be buying tulips did not, in any way, make tulips inherently more valuable, and it merely ensured that the eventual collapse would be exponentially larger and more destructive. That complicated explanations for irrational price movements are almost invariably post hoc rationalizations. When proponents began fabricating elaborate economic theories to justify why tulip bulbs deserved such stratospheric prices, they were simply constructing intricate justifications for what they desperately wanted to believe and what benefited them in the moment. Finally, and critically, that timing almost always matters far more than insightful analysis during a bubble. Being entirely correct in discerning that tulips were grotesquely overvalued in November 1636 offered absolutely no financial protection if one chose to bet against the market, only to be completely ruined before the market's true. The final collapse in February 1637. These profound lessons were not only clearly discernible in 1637, they remain powerfully relevant today, yet they are still, with alarming consistency, mostly ignored whenever a new and exciting asset class begins its rapid, seemingly unstoppable appreciation. Perhaps the most profound and unsettling insight offered by the Tulip Mania operates on a meta level. Human societies, with disheartening regularity, repeat the very same patterns of speculative excess across centuries, often despite a conscious awareness of their own history. We consistently reassure ourselves with the comforting delusion that this time is different, believing we are inherently smarter than previous generations. That modern markets are undeniably more sophisticated, and that robust regulations will surely prevent the worst excesses. And yet, almost without fail, we then proceed to inflate entirely new bubbles, perhaps slightly different in their specific details or underlying assets, but chillingly identical in their fundamental psychological and dynamic processes. And when these new bubbles inevitably burst, we, as a society, collectively suffer the very same grim consequences: widespread financial losses, significant social disruption, countless individual tragedies, and often a lingering collective trauma. The Tulip Mania stands as the first exceptionally well-documented historical example of this repeating pattern. It was certainly not the last, and it will assuredly not be. As long as humans possess access to capital, retain the ability to trade, and are driven by the innate psychological impulses that make speculation so powerfully tempting, bubbles will continue to form, and they will, without fail, continue to burst. Thus, the pertinent question is no longer whether future generations will finally heed the clear and compelling warning offered by the Tulip Mania. Experience strongly suggests they will not. Instead, the more pragmatic question becomes whether they will, at the very least, prepare for the inevitable bursting of future bubbles with greater foresight and resilience than the Dutch managed in 1637. Regrettably, the accumulating historical evidence suggests that we have not yet even learned that fundamental lesson.